Welcome back to CBH Talks, and welcome if you're here for the first time. Today, we are having a talk on Rethinking Empire, John Norquay's legacy and Canada's historical landscape. I'm joined today by Ryan Minucha and author Gerald Friesen. He's a distinguished professor emeritus at the Department of History in the University of Manitoba. He's written and edited several books and articles, including The Canadian Prairies, A History, River Road, Citizens and Nations, Immigrants in Prairie Cities, which was co-written with Roy Lowen, and Canadians and Their Pasts. He is also the author of the book that we'll be discussing here today, the biography on John Norquay. And we're also joined by Ryan Minucha, a CBHA board member, along with me. He'll be leading the conversation today. Ryan is an expert on interprovincial trade in Canada, and he's frequently called upon to advise governments and agencies. And his work has appeared in prominent Canadian peer-reviewed legal journals and national newspapers. More recently, his book, Booze, Cigarettes, and Constitutional Dust-Ups, Canada's Quest for Interprovincial Free Trade, won the 2022 Donner Prize for Best in Canadian Public Policy and Writing, and he was a finalist for the 2023 Bosseil Prize for Public Policy. Welcome, both of you. Ryan, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you so much, Tabitha. Jerry, so great to have you on this talk. Really looking forward to this conversation. I think we have to start with, this is a 400-page, meticulously researched, very well-written book on an individual that most Canadians and even most Manitobans have probably never heard of. Who is John Norquay, and why should we be learning about him?
John Norquay is an English-speaking and Bungi-speaking, Cree and Ojibwa-speaking, Anishinaabe, Latin and Greek student who grew up in Red River, born 1841, became an assembly member when Manitoba was created in 1871, premier in 1878, for the 9 pivotal years when Manitoba essentially established the foundation that exists to this day. So he's really the founding, despite Louis Riel's claim, the founding premier of Manitoba. Louis Riel has become an honorary premier, so he's now the first premier of Manitoba, Norquay the second, Wabkanu the third. But Norquay's importance is in the founding of Manitoba and in arguments about both federalism and the federal state in Canada, something you're very big on, and I would say in Métis-ness, in his distinction from, or difference from Riel as an important Métis figure in Canada in the 19th century, but with perspectives that held for 100 years. So Norquay has many important roles: federal, provincial foundation, and of all of them, perhaps the one that'll strike you the most is the Canadian Pacific Railway and government business relations in the 1880s, because he was central to that story, just as John A. and George Stephen were. And so those are the kinds of things I would pick out.
Excellent, excellent. It sounds like a lot to unpack there. Jerry, I guess let's go back to Manitoba in the Victorian period. What was the political landscape that John Norquay came of age in? What, a lot of things we take for granted right now about what we understand the political apparatus of Canada to be. What was he stepping into when he stepped into the Manitoba legislature and became a public servant?
Okay, let's think about that. The 1840s, the 1850s, the 1860s. The Hudson's Bay Company has a trading monopoly in the Northwest and is attempting to hold back the Métis free traders until they lose that battle in 1849. So the Hudson's Bay Company is still the dominant economic force, and by far the organizer of exports from the Northwest. Over 95% of the exports through the early 1870s are Hudson's Bay Company furs. And so we've got to think of Manitoba, first of all, as a fur trade enterprise. Then we think of it as a village that extends about 100 miles from Lake Winnipeg to the international border and 50 miles from Upper Fort Garry westward to Portage la Prairie. Along those two rivers, the Red River north-south, the Assiniboine west-east, we're talking about one lot after another, farm after farm. And so this is 150 miles of a village, Manitoba in 1870, 12,000 people, not large, 80% of them mixed ancestry. Half of that, little over half, 57%, French and Michif speaking. And I emphasize the Michif because most of the Métis would have spoken Michif more than pure French. And the English, Bungi and English speaking. Bungi being a dialect of English, not a language in the way that Michif is, marrying Ojibwe and French. A dialect in which you've got Gaelic and Cree and Anishinaabe and English, all mixed up in an unusual sing-song kind of fur trade English that was really the inheritance of Indigenous peoples in English language circles for over several generations. So Manitoba, fur trade empire, and then of course everybody knows 1869-70, John A. tried to buy essentially the Hudson's Bay Company rights. Riel led a resistance to that purchase. He held the province or the community together for 9 months, resisting Macdonald. And then in the end, Macdonald's Wolseley expedition arrived in Red River. Riel fled, and Adams Archibald arrived to be the lieutenant governor of that new Manitoba. Elections were held, and beginning of 1871, let me think about this, the beginning of 1871, yes, the legislature commenced its governing of Manitoba.
Excellent. And, you know, as Manitoba transitions through this period, maybe before we get into, John Norquay's own political career, you sort of paint a picture of his own upbringing. He had as I understand, he was an orphan by the age of 8, and sort of how his foundational years and early career set himself on to colliding with this new Manitoba as of the 1870s.
Well, remember that Red River had lots of parish schools, almost like little log cabins that would hold 30 or 40 or 50 and sometimes 60 students working with slates, with sticks to mark them, and basically acquiring a literacy and a numeracy that more or less worked. It was not an illiterate community. Norquay, it turned out, was superb in that school. And as a parish scholar, stood out. At that moment, when he was 9 years old, an Anglican diocese was created with a bishop, 1849, 1850. And that bishop decided that he would create what he called collegiate school that would be the equivalent of a prep school for Oxford and Cambridge. So he would teach the Latin and Greek. He would teach the advanced math, including calculus, the languages and the math being what you had to have to get into Oxford and Cambridge. And he would give a scholarship for 1 or 2 of the best students in the parish schools. That would supplement the 20 or 30 fur trade officers' children who could pay their way. And so Norquay stood out from the beginning. By 12 years old, he was invited in. He lived on that scholarship for the next 4 years. So between his own ages of 13 and 17, he became one of the most outstanding graduates. Now understand that others among those graduates, I'm thinking here of one who became a master of a Cambridge college, saw him as an intellectual equal. So that's how we have to think of him, an orphan who suddenly acquires learning. And he became a teacher. For the next 7 years, he taught while running a small farm. He was essentially an impressive young man who had risen far beyond what many of his colleagues in those parish schools had attained.
Amazing. And as we now kind of veer into his entry to the political scene, curious just on this matter, like if you can think, what were some like values, or like what can we map on from his teacher era days and before, and what will he bring with him as we start to talk about his political career, the starts of his political career?
First of all, it's an Anglican bishop who's picked him up, and it's an Anglican school in which he serves, studies, and he becomes a firm Christian Anglican Protestant, a low church, as they would have said, evangelical Anglican, not a high church. So that's number one, I would say. Number two is the empire. This is the British Empire's highest moment, I think. The bishop often talks about how, in his sermons in Red River, how the church and Britain will be leading the world into this new phase of empire. And certainly Norquay would have adopted that. He would learn, too, history, biblical history and secular history. And so he's aware of the Industrial Revolution, for example. He's aware of the principles of property. He understands and works with the market. And so this is a man who is essentially a 19th century English capitalist, if you want, in the 1850s and 1860s.
Interesting. All right, now we'll get into the starts of his political career. I guess to start off, as he, what were the political issues of the day as he rose on scene? Maybe even explain how he jumped from being a teacher to a politician, and what were the issues that Manitoba, and maybe even contextualizing the issues that Manitoba and Canada were grappling with at this time.
The first thing to say is that 1869-70, the resistance of Red River to Canada's takeover was crucial to everyone in the prairies for the next decade. And Norquay happened to be off at a fur trade post, conducting a fur trade during most of the months of that resistance. So he came back only in time to be part of a meeting where his parish selected his cousin as the representative in Riel's provisional government. And so his role in this period, he said later, was to be a moderate, to say, let's keep things quiet, let's not have violence, let's simply negotiate. And so he walked into the assembly 9 months later because his cousin didn't want to serve in the assembly. And because the cousin recognized that Norquay was far more literate, far more articulate, far more dedicated, probably far more intelligent in that sense of the modern ways of the West than this cousin was. So that's where I would start. I don't know where you want to go from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's excellent. And one of the issues that Manitoba was starting to grapple with, or would grapple with, was the changing composition of the electoral base, the influx of the Orangement from Ontario being a dominant portion of that, and the Manitoba polity sort of transforming under everyone's feet.
That's a good way of putting it. Because essentially what happened over the 1870s is that there was a French Métis speaking community that became increasingly French language as Quebecers came in to help lead the Catholic portion of the population. An English Métis community called Old Settlers, Protestant, but very much rooted in Red River and that past. And then these newcomers, most of whom were Ontarian, and many of whom were Orange Lodge members who brought with them an awareness that Thomas Scott had been executed by Riel, or so it was said, in 1870, and that crime, as they saw it, should be punished in some way. And so the first half of the 70s, the politics involves French versus English, Catholic versus Protestant, but particularly Ontarian Orange Lodge versus Old Settler Red River. The latter half of the 1870s, you move on, and it becomes a French versus English kind of battle. Many Métis have left Manitoba in the 1870s, that is the Michif French in particular, and have moved to Montana or into the Northwest Territories. And so Norquay, by the end of the 1870s, is sitting on a rather unstable assembly. But in 1878, he's by far the most prominent figure in the English language faction in the assembly. And the only opponent of equal strength is a man named Joseph Royal. And Royal is a Quebecer, a very articulate, very able author and lawyer and newspaper publisher. And the two of them are really the dominant forces in the House.
Excellent. Excellent. So yeah, I guess sort of to sort of draw on that, Norquay, the political landscape is shifting. Party politics hadn't really arrived in Manitoba yet. Manitoba wasn't a true province at this point in time. And the demographics of the province were really shaping the issues of the day. And so maybe you can sort of on that backswing there, explain John Norquay's rise to power from his entry into the assembly up until perhaps his election as a premier, sort of setting what were some of the things, explaining that his rise to power and the cult of personality that kind of surrounded him.
Well, first of all, he was dominant in the House. There was no one more powerful as a speaker. He was also witty. He loved to joke with his colleagues in the House and to mock some of their pretensions. And he was extremely eloquent. There's no other way to put it. Alexander Morris, who was a very powerful Canadian politician who was the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba, described Norquay as the most eloquent of the assembly members by far. So Norquay's position on the economic issues of the 1870s was very much one of let's adapt to the new order immediately. Let's not try and hold things back. Let's adopt laws associated with the market. Let's adopt private property. Let's ensure that people have their lots guaranteed. But let's sell land as quickly as we can. The master-servant relationship, that legislation should be passed immediately. We shouldn't let the church run things. Let's not have a bishop controlling a vast chunk of land. And that, of course, was one of the things the Roman Catholics were seeking. But Norquay wanted to develop like in Ontario in that sense. He was prepared to listen to Ontarians, to adopt Ontarian legislation, and essentially to create a smaller Manitoba, or a smaller Ontario in Manitoba.
Excellent. Amazing. Yeah, and one of the issues is you in such great detail we've discussed throughout the book and explained upon is the CPR. The CPR was the issue that Norquay grappled with for almost his entire political career. Maybe you could explain what the CPR issue was, contextualize it in Manitoba and Canada and even the rest of the world, and sort of what was Norquay's role in the CPR?
I could say, first of all, that the politics of the 1870s was land and French-English Protestant-Catholic relations. The politics of the 1880s was business and in particular railways. That's where the discussions focus. Manitoba had a railway as of the end of 1878. In other words, Norquay's first year in power. It came from St. Paul, Minneapolis, was called the St. Paul, Minneapolis and Manitoba Railway. And so any talk of the CPR being absolutely pivotal in Manitoba's future is Eastern Canadian talk. It's not Western Canadian talk. There was one railway already. Who owned it? Well, Donald Smith, George Stephen, James Hill, the consortium, or the syndicate as it was called, that became the CPR. So the first problem we've got is that when the CPR is created in 1880-81, the other outlet is also owned by the same corporate trio with a couple of others, but they're the crucial ones. As soon as John A. signed that contract with the CPR, as soon as the clauses became apparent, Manitobans were up in arms. Yes, they wanted a CPR, but they didn't want a CPR owned by this syndicate, Stephen, Smith, and Hill. And so what are they going to do? They argued strongly, but unavailing, to change the actual contract, because there's a clause, number 15 in the CPR contract, that guaranteed the CPR a monopoly on all trade into and out of Prairie Canada for the next 20 years or 10 years after the railway is built. A monopoly clause, as it was called. As soon as it was announced, people in St. Paul were laughing, saying, boy, did Jim Hill ever put one over on John A. Macdonald. Imagine that, guaranteeing a monopoly. But it stuck. And there was Norquay's problem for the next 7 years. How does he deal with the service to rural Manitoba that farmers required if they were to have an economic enterprise? And it was an incredibly difficult 6 years, 7 years for Norquay. There's no question about it. He passed legislation, I would say 6 times between 1881 and 1884 for new railways, branch railways, 4 of which would have run to the United States and broken that monopoly. And this is where one of our first big problems in Confederation emerges. John A. Macdonald disallowed them all because he had the federal power of disallowance over provincial railway legislation. And so that's the heart of John A. And I suppose takes us all the way to Ryan Minucha and federal provincial relations in the 21st century.
Amazing. But if you could straw man the argument for why the justifications for a monopoly clause, or at least sort of, obviously you've got Manitoba's interest on the one hand. What was John A. trying to accomplish? Why was, one might have been pulled over him, but what was John A. dealing with at the same time?
Well, he accepted George Stephen's basic argument to build a railway from wherever you want to say, from Ontario, southern Ontario to Manitoba, over the Great Lakes, over Lake Superior, north of Lake Superior. There's going to be no traffic for a generation. It's a guaranteed loser. Anybody who builds a railway south of Lake Superior from Winnipeg is going to bankrupt the CPR. So Macdonald accepted Stephen's argument. Having accepted it, his argument was, we cannot break the contract because the investors in the CPR, largely in England and the United States, have this as a guarantee of their return. And so we're in the markets now, and we have to maintain Canada's economic credibility. And so that's the Macdonald argument. It's a perfectly reasonable one, but it doesn't answer the problem of the Manitoba farmer, whom John A. has encouraged to go to Prairie Canada, who can't survive if he's got to have an ox hauling one load of grain 50 miles in winter and selling it to the 1 or 2 or 3 grain elevators that are within reach, risking life and limb every January, February. So that's the crunch that Norquay faced throughout the 1880s.
Interesting. And staying on this railway theme, it's fascinating. You really do get the sense of the sheer power Stephen, the CPR Macdonald had, and it was really brought to light in the episode. And you'll make this more articulate. But when Norquay was traveling to the financial capitals all over North America for what I think was the Hudson Bay Railroad,
and for the Red River Railroad.
That's it. Yeah.
Both of them. In 1887, he finally said, "Look, the CPR is complete." November 1885. Macdonald had come to Manitoba in 1886 and said, yes, that's going to end. That monopoly clause will end soon. His Minister of Railways and his Minister of the Interior in the next few months also said, yeah, now that the CPR has been done, an amazing feat that they have completed in 5 years, now we can loosen these monopoly this monopoly clause. And so Norquay went to Ottawa in April of 1887 and said, okay, let's figure out how we can do this. And Macdonald essentially said, no way. I'm keeping it for a minimum, he thought, of 4 or 5 years. Perhaps not the 10 that were in the clause, but at least 4 or 5 to keep the markets happy. Norquay came back and said, I'm going to lose power to his own followers if I knuckle under. I'm going to build a railway for sure that's going to get us to international ports. One will go south, the Red River Valley Railway, and connect with a CPR competitor, the Northern Pacific, and we will have a transcontinental link that way. And the other will go north, Hudson Bay Railway. And that route, the shortest by far to Europe and England, they thought at that time would work easily. It turned out not to be such an easy railway to operate, and still is a difficult railway to operate. But those were the two angles. And so Norquay started both railways, the construction on both, and then went to American markets and Canadian financial markets to find the money. This was in 1887. His first stop was London. And ironically, John Rose, who was Macdonald's close friend and former finance minister, said yes, he would finance that Manitoba line for $1 million. Macdonald got a telegram to him almost instantly saying, get out of that. And Rose, of course, accepted Macdonald's insistence. And so London was suddenly closed. Norquay went to Chicago. Nobody would fund the railway, went to New York, had several good discussions, including, it seems, a deal. But again, Canadian Pacific and Tory party campaign against the deal, and boom, no money. He went to Toronto, and finally he went to Montreal. They got a wee bit of money from the Sulpician order, despite Macdonald saying no way. But that was it, not enough to build the railway. And by I would say the end of November 1887, the Manitoba government was bankrupt. It had no money to pay its civil service. And what could Norquay do? He asked Macdonald to give an advance or a guarantee of an advance to his bank, Norquay's Manitoba government's bank was the Merchants Bank. And the Merchants Bank said they would give Manitoba a short-term loan against the federal subsidy, which would be arriving on January 1st, 88. Again, George Stephen stepped in. A lovely telegram in the Macdonald papers, basically saying to Macdonald, Norquay should feel the error of his ways. The finance department that had welcomed the idea of a subsidy, an advance, suddenly turned cold, and the advance was not made. So Manitoba at that point is essentially bankrupt. At this point, Macdonald sends Charles Tupper, who had been negotiating in Washington, of all things, a fisheries treaty, to have a little Christmas visit with his son and to stiffen the backs of Norquay's cabinet members who are going to vote against him. And 2 days before Christmas, 1887, they say to him, they say to Norquay, we are not going to back you anymore. We are leaving the government if you stay. And Norquay had to resign. So John A. Macdonald and George Stephen did it. They pushed Norquay out of office, and that was the end of Norquay's premiership. 9 long years of incredible, I think, development in Manitoba with this one railway battle. But in the end, John A. and the contract and George Stephen won.
Wow. It just really goes to show the sheer power. You know, that we're talking about like the peak Gilded Age period right now, where railway barons ruled, and you know the political machinery sort of was at their beck and call in a way. Just the sheer power they had from Ottawa and Eastern Canada to make these calls that effectively caused the bankruptcy of Manitoba and the crumbling of Norquay's political career. Now, one thing that's interesting, though, is that while all this is happening, you know, Norquay is seen as sort of the advocate for Manitoba, right? He's this statesman, and you know, there have been times where even the opposition was able to sort of put down their swords, and he was mustering the entirety of the parliament around him. He was well loved, and people saw him as the one fighting back for Manitoban interests. And you describe in this book these lavish, I mean, they're lavish, but extensive sorties to Ottawa to entreaty ministers and civil servants and even John A. himself as to the interests of Manitoba. He would stay for weeks on end as a diplomat on behalf of Manitoba. Perhaps you can speak to John Norquay, the diplomat, who was sort of having to rally at home and then advocate on one of his many sorties to Ottawa.
That's a good way of putting things. And by talking about the railways, which are so important to a business history group, we've ignored essentially the great strengths of Norquay in his 9 years. And one of the great strengths was the reinforcing of Manitoba as a province. How to start this? I would say that Norquay invented the idea of provincial diplomatic expeditions to Ottawa. He had his first in 1879 and won a very important concession. The CPR would not, when it was eventually contracted, run north through the Interlake toward Edmonton. Rather, it would run straight west through Manitoba's richest farm fields. And so as early as that very first expedition to Ottawa, Norquay had established an important victory. Thereafter, he would take 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 even members of the Assembly and other business people to Ottawa once a year, stay for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, even 6 weeks, making an impact, going to parties, going to receptions, going to the House of Commons and talking in the loges behind the chamber, meeting privately with John A. and other ministers, lobbying Manitoba's case. And so in short order, not only did he get that railway change, but he got an expansion of the boundary, he got increases in the subsidy, he created essentially a workable Manitoba. because it was growing very quickly. Manitoba grew by 10 times in 20 years in population. Winnipeg was a city of 20,000 by 1883. And so this is a huge change. And Norquay's diplomacy essentially sustained the economy and government in the province during that period. I guess I would say Norquay was a very successful politician on the federal provincial scene.
That's amazing. And, you know, one of the things we have to, I think, kind of veer into now is the talk of the armed conflict that took place, or I guess you call it, or Norquay himself called it a rebellion. I think he had a specific term for it, but how the antagonism between Manitoba and then even within Manitoba, the Métis and the non-Métis in Manitoba, and you'll speak to this better than I am, and Ottawa, as a domestic tension that he was having to deal with, and it was accelerated by this railroad issue and the anti-Eastern sentiment that was brewing because of the feeling of being taken advantage of, and those in Manitoba had sort of wanting to be part of the capitalist agenda and feeling as though their interests were being subjugated.
Well put. In the Northwest, the expectation had been, and especially this is true in Prince Albert and Edmonton, that the railway was going to follow that northern route through fertile park belt rather than on the dry plains. And so there were many people. Prince Albert itself had 5,000 residents in 1883, expecting the CPR, and then discovering that the CPR was going to head south through Regina to Calgary. The disappointment in Prince Albert and District underlay the invitation to Riel, then living in Montana, to come back and conduct essentially a Norquay-like campaign on behalf of Northwest rights that would sustain the Métis, yes, and their river lots and their unique demands at that point, but would also sustain those white businessmen who had staked quite a bit, all their money, on Prince Albert and Edmonton as the places that would be developing in the Northwest. And so that is what lay behind that Métis, what some have called a civil war, and that Norquay, you say, chose the word unfortunate family incident, unfortunate family conflict, to describe what happened. Because in 1885, Riel, having found no change in Macdonald's policies toward the Northwest, had declared a provisional government as he had 15 years earlier. Dumont, Gabriel Dumont, Riel's military ally, then pushed for war. And within 2 weeks, there was essentially a civil war breakout. A dozen Mounties were shot by Métis at Duck Lake, and all of a sudden, Canada is propelled into one of Queen Victoria's little wars. And that's another circumstance of enormous importance in Canadian history. Macdonald sends 5,000 troops westward, including Norquay's sons, because Norquay is on the other side. Norquay believes Riel should have negotiated, not fought. And so Macdonald essentially raises the temperature of racism in this country and the anti-Indigenous sentiment and an anti-French or a French-English Catholic Protestant hostility as well through this decision of 1885. So Norquay, recognizing the situation, supports John A. reluctantly, while sympathizing with and understanding the circumstances of the Métis and the First Nations in the Northwest.
And before, because I definitely want to leave time to talk about, Manitoba, the Manitoba specific economy that Norquay was helping foster, and including his own entrepreneurial endeavors. Staying on this topic of Riel and Norquay, if you could sort of maybe paint us a picture of the worldviews of these two important prairie leaders who were contemporaries of one another, and you've kind of done so, and how they aligned and diverged, and what that meant, and the benefits and the challenges it imposed on Norquay's own political career as a result of this rebellion.
Riel and Norquay sit there like two contrasting figures with the same concerns. Norquay, as I've described him, is a capitalist, a Protestant, an individualist who believes that everyone should make their own way. Riel, I think, having been trained in Quebec, having been schooled in Montreal, having worked in a Montreal law office, has read, I suspect, although I don't know, French nationalist literature of the mid-19th century, certainly has been educated in Quebec nationalism of the 1860s. Riel develops this idea of nation for the Métis, that the Métis are a distinct nation, separate from First Nations, separate from other other European peoples, and they are a collective or a community of their own that deserve their place in the world. Indeed, at sometimes he argued they should have their own territory, with boundaries. And other times he said we should receive money from Ottawa for the land we're giving up. We should say that we're giving up 100 million acres at 25 cents an acre, because that's the economic strength of the Métis at this point. In First Nations should receive 12.5 cents an acre, because their economic productivity is half that of the Métis. And the Métis, I suspect he's saying, are half as productive in their enterprises as white Canadians whose land is being sold by the government at $1 an acre. So you can see the kind of thinking that might be in Riel's head. But the key point is nation. He sees the Métis as independent and needing defense of rights as a nation. And Norquay, the individualist, the Protestant, Riel, the collectivist, the Catholic. That's how I see the two of them. But they both sympathize with First Nations. They understand the Métis problems of the 1880s. They've got different solutions. My suggestion now is that the Norquay approach is what the federal government adopted both in the 1880s and for the next century. It essentially ignored Métis as a collectivity, rejected the concept of Métis collective rights. And it was only in the 50s and 60s when people like Malcolm Brady and Jim Norris and these other advocates brought the Métis Nation argument forward into national conversation. And then that famous meeting, Harry Daniels and Pierre Trudeau, that's suddenly put not just Indian and Inuit, but Métis as well in the Constitution in Section 35. And suddenly Riel's concept of Métis as nation, of Métis as indigenous, Métis as having collective rights becomes important again.
Fascinating. And, at the end of your book, you talk about this, kind of pulling back to Norquay. Norquay, a man of many identities. He was a man of, as you said at the outset, many languages, and he was sort of English Métis himself, and he was part of the economic apparatus, and he was also very community-oriented, religious. Sort of as we enter into more of his personal business enterprises here, also speaking to some of the racism that he endured. If we get more explicitly sort of the sources of it and how that impacted him and how that impacted his relations with others.
Well, you know that some of those Orange Lodge members from Ontario and some other Protestants in Manitoba believed that mixed race, and they've had that concept of race in their minds firmly at that time, created a lesser human being. It's as simple as that. Just as in the United States, the Civil War era embedded these race concepts in the minds of people, so in Canada, this Métis status concerned them greatly. And so we take people like John Schultz here in Manitoba. He respected and treated as children First Nations. He did not respect and wished to push out as far as possible people who were of mixed ancestry. And so to understand that racism, there is a special racism, I think, directed at Métis peoples in the 1870s and 80s on the part of some people. And Norquay, like Riel, experienced it. I quote at length one letter to John A. from a Manitoban, William Wagner, in 1885, that expresses this racism more clearly than anywhere else. I won't go into it now, but it's a very, I think, contemptible but illustrative letter. Norquay faced this kind of hostility in the Conservative Party. Literally, he founded the Conservative Party of Manitoba of necessity, because if he hadn't done so, some of those Orange Lodge people would have turfed him in 1883. And so he went along with it and said, okay, I'm not only a federal conservative, I'm a provincial conservative, and will accept a two-party system henceforth. Having done so, he then had to wage a constant war against Orange Lodge members in Winnipeg, who eventually called themselves the capital O, capital G, Old Guard, who were John A. Macdonald loyalists, never accepted Norquay as leader, and operated by arguing against him whenever possible. And so that contest went on right through the mid-1880s, was, I think, strengthened by the fact that an armed uprising occurred in the Northwest. And so people simply said, we can't trust these mixed ancestry peoples, whom they called half-breeds, of course. Norquay didn't like that word. In fact, used it only twice in documentary evidence in debates. And each time that he did, he said, I'm proud of the blood in this arm, and he raised it in the legislature, all the blood in this arm, and argued against these people like Joe Martin, liberal and very, very aggressive, hostile opponents.
Oh, wow. Now, shifting to sort of Manitoba's economy, you know, John Norquay, very much a statesman, but he was also, from your book, would appear to be an entrepreneur, an investor, a participant in the economic order. Maybe you could speak to this other identity of John Norquay, and it sometimes conflicted and it got him in some hot water politically, but this business-minded John Norquay.
Like many people, he purchased land. He even purchased 6 Métis scrip with a couple of business allies in the city of Winnipeg. He invested apparently in a gold mine that produced some gold at Lake of the Woods. And he ended up, I suppose unwittingly, but the logic is clear, president of a coal mine at Medicine Hat. And the logic was that no one had better ties in Ottawa than John Norquay of the people who wanted to build this mine. And he was the likeliest to get John A. Macdonald on side. which he did, to ensure that they got ownership of that territory, because it was originally destined to be a Blackfoot reserve, a very large Blackfoot holding. And there were a number of individuals who had claimed land right around a clearly potentially strong coal seam, right just outside Medicine Hat. And so to get control of the land, these people said that, Norquay would be a great president of this coal company because he could go to Ottawa and talk to John A., which he did, and they could get control of that mine. Norquay was approached dozens of times also by friends and acquaintances to sign promissory notes because they thought of him as rich. After all, he's a politician. And they wanted money. And so he signed a number, possibly as many as a dozen promissory notes for people. And then, of course, they go broke, and Norquay's holding the bag. So Norquay's business career is one of many enterprises, usually undertaken because there's a promoter involved who wants to get something done and believes government can help him. And that's how Norquay gets into all these mines, forests, land purchases, town sites, you name it. He's had his name attached to a dozen such enterprises. And they all, unfortunately for him, don't turn out.
And one part that doesn't turn out is, and it seems to have a dramatic impact on not only him personally, but also the political landscape, is the property crash of the early 1800s or the early 1880s.
Yes.
Maybe you can speak to that one and what its impact was.
That was amazing because having got the CPR contract at the end of 1881, knowledge, Van Horn arrived January 1, 1882, knowledge that this is going to be the center of the West because the shops are going to be in Winnipeg. Winnipeg's boom for the next few months is extraordinary. And, it's not just hundreds, but thousands of people arrive. Pierre Burton has a wonderful chapter in that book from long ago on the CPR, on the boom in Winnipeg in the beginning of the 1880s. Champagne in the bathtub sort of talk. And it was like that. And Norquay, taking advantage, decided he would buy a chunk of land, the equivalent of 4 city lots, directly opposite Government House and the Legislative Assembly for himself at a very high cost. And so they're an example of the people who bought on the rise of the boom. And then, of course, the railway's here, it's moving west. Now the excitement is Moose Jaw, then the excitement is Calgary, then the excitement is Vancouver. And Winnipeg, of course, is now just an ordinary site on the railway. Bust. So Norquay's $10,000 lot suddenly becomes a $4,000 lot, and he's absorbing a $6,000 disaster. On top of that, he owns a farm, which he's owned all along, and he can no longer make the mortgage on that. And so not only did the Manitoba government go bankrupt in 1887, but Norquay lost the last land he owned in that same month.
They went bankrupt together. They really are two stories intertwined.
Yes.
And, in terms of the property interests, one thing that you mentioned we should speak to is, of course, there was lots of influx of immigrants from Canada and the rest of the world. You do a great job of describing the composition of the members of provincial parliament as a way to encapsulate sort of the influx of, but the Saulteaux and the Cree and the Blackfoot communities and their impact, the dislocation that they were experiencing at this time. And, to some extent, Norquay's sort of sympathy, it may not be the right word, but he sort of speaking to his awareness and understanding of its impact on Indigenous communities in the province. If you could speak to that.
I could, because what's very clear is that those people who grew up in Red River understood and treated as equals First Nations and Métis of every description. And you see them lamenting the arrivals from Eastern Canada who do not treat First Nations and Métis people as equals. And you see there are quotations that I use from the Legislative Assembly where you've got speeches being reported. James Mackay, who was one of Norquay's closest allies in government, saying, if you treat these people as adults, they're going to respond as adults. But of course, that wasn't what the case. And Canadian Indigenous policy was to treat Indigenous people as children and to take away all that power that they might have had. Norquay and his family, you see it in the letters back and forth within the family, accepted First Nation peoples as their equals. They didn't trust all of them completely. Those people out on the far plains had been enemies from time to time, but they were always equals. And so one of the things that Norquay insisted on was that sense of equality among individuals.
And, as we sort of, as we we're coming towards the end of his political career. We've just talked about, your book goes into it, the disruption by Stephen and Macdonald and the CPR and his own personal endeavors into business sort of, but, stepping back a bit, obviously, I think through this book, we really come to understand John Norquay as an individual and Manitoba during this very, very important formative period. If the lessons that might be extracted, and there's some early themes that still persist to this day, the tension between English and French, the tension between Indigenous Métis and settler, but also the development of an economy shifting from, as you described, primarily fur trading to agrarian to more than agrarian. What are some of the lessons or the themes that continue to feed through and have lasting, lingering effects, I guess, to the modern day in Manitoba and perhaps Canadian politics? Maybe it helps us understand certain things better that are going on.
Well, one for sure is one you know a huge amount about, and that's the federal-provincial relationship. Norquay was very clear very early on the nature of the stresses between Ottawa and the provinces. And Manitoba had been created less than equal because it didn't own its own resources and land. And so one of the crucial lessons, I think, was his awareness that he had to change Ottawa's perspective on relations with provinces. And he became as important as Mowat or Blair or Honoré Mercier in establishing a kind of provincial strength within the federal system. And so I regard Norquay as one of the innovators in understanding the nature of federal-provincial relations and the necessity of having a sense of equal governments within their own sphere. And so, the word sometimes used of shared sovereignty between Ottawa and the provinces, Norquay was one of the first to argue that. You find it as early as 1883 in the throne speech when he makes that very case and says that the provinces should get together and renegotiate confederation. And so I see him as taking that on. I see him as taking on the issue of race and having a particular view of what we now call race and racism, because obviously he insisted on equality for all within the country, not nation to nation, as Riel would have said, but individuals, with that one First Nation exception. What else would I pick out? Well, I would say he was one of the great statesmen of that generation. And to me, it's amazing that he was forgotten. But of course, that happens. And we haven't discussed it, but the letters in Norquay's office were put in a trunk, and they suddenly surfaced in the Manitoba archives 100 years later. They had to be organized and indexed and so on, according to the terms of a will. And so when I retired, these papers were suddenly available. 4,000 letters to him, 1,000 letters by him, 2,000 other documents. And so that's how I was able to tell this story.
It's amazing, amazing. And it's an amazing story. I feel very, very. Is there anything else you wish to say about the John Norquay that we haven't spoken to as we wrap up here? But because he's got, I mean, what an incredible individual.
He was an amazing guy and a witty guy and a very intelligent man, and one who held his own. You know, an orphan of English speaking and mixed ancestry, rising to this position, holding his own in Wall Street, in Chicago, in those rooms in Ottawa. An amazing guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely comes from the book. Thank you so much for this conversation. Very much enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time today. I think we could talk about this forever. But thank you both so much. As an American, Jerry, I have to say I find Norquay's views on provincial versus the federal government to be super interesting and a new avenue for me to explore. And as I continue to learn more and more about Canadian history. So thank you both so much for being here today. This was a wonderful CBH Talk. We hope that you enjoyed it as well, those of you who are listening at home. And thank you both to Ryan and Jerry, and we can't wait to see you back on the next CBHA Talk.